Some mornings, sermons are really, really hard to get out. There are a few different reasons for that. Occasionally there's something in the text that's just difficult to explain. Sometimes it's more like there's a message that sits at odds with society or touches on some sort of polarizing modern issue. But sometimes, even when you're dealing with some significant concepts or amazing imagery, it just feels like the words don't want to speak. And you have to wrestle them both off the page and then back onto it. This is one of those weeks for me. It isn't that our passages don't have anything to say. Each has some unusual details or long-standing traditions attached to them that could provide a variety of jumping-off points, such as what many Christians view as the prefiguring of the Trinity in our Genesis reading, or Colossians' universe-reconciling vision of the cosmic Christ, or even the familiar but sometimes abused story of Mary and Martha. Each has its own messages. Each has a few levels of meaning we could play with. So if nothing else, it rarely hurts to offer a congregation some context. So, looking at our gospel reading, one of the first details to point out is that this tale of the two sisters falls immediately between last week's parable of the Good Samaritan and next week's presentation of the Lord's Prayer. Same passage, all just one long connection of text. Commentators do like to make a fairly big deal out of connecting the Good Samaritan with this text, but I have yet to see anybody try to connect either of those with the Lord's Prayer. Weird little detail, but there it is. Secondly, there are some cultural things going on that, while not necessarily unexpected, should probably still be pointed out. The primary one would be an awareness of normative gender roles in Jesus' day. Any reader from the time would have observed Martha fulfilling her expected duties and respecting her own position as a woman in the first century Middle East. Much like older American culture, with its influences drawn from various interpretations and understandings of the Bible, the women of a household would have been expected to see to the comfort of guests and the management of their visit and experiences. Men, on the other hand, were much more likely to sit together in conversation while everything was being prepared for them behind the scenes. So Mary's behavior would have stood out, not necessarily because she was subverting gender roles, which would be reading a modern concept back onto the text's expression of itself. But people would have certainly noticed her under-functioning in regard to their societal expectations. Luke has also planted a few oddities within the text. One is his word for Martha's many tasks. The verb form of this term, normally translated along the lines of to serve or to minister, is found throughout the New Testament. However, the noun form that appears here is uncommon outside of Luke and Paul's writings. If we were to use a consistent translation wherever it appears, we'd probably notice a familiar title sitting right in the middle of this word: deaconing. This is the same kind of activity the early church thought was so important, meeting the physical needs of orphans, widows, and the poor, that they set aside specific individuals to ensure that it was managed and accomplished well. So despite what we might read as Martha simply futzing about with menial tasks, Luke is actually emphasizing the dignity and significance of her labor within that community. Another unusual thing here is Luke's description of Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. While that sounds more or less passive to our ears, there's a subtle intensity to his word choice, suggesting something more like she had been begging or imploring to be allowed to take that position. She knew that her participation in conversation with this renowned teacher was an uncommon privilege. She hadn't simply felt a little bit lazy and snuck away from helping Martha out behind the scenes only to hide among the other guests. She had struggled to take on this mantle of a full disciple. Now, the church has a long history of pitting these two sisters against one another, accusing Martha of demonstrating the inferior way of works, while Mary embodies the more enlightened path of faith. We mistakenly deride the first while lifting up a false image of the second, and in the process, end up placing impossible demands on Christian women in general. While still expecting women to manage and fulfill all the duties of traditional gender roles, as they're shown in this text, they also become required to give their full, demure, and unquestioning attention to God, or more directly, the male authorities within their community, if we're really being honest. To speak up and ask for help is to reveal oneself to be a Martha and a complainer, while to genuinely interact with what one is being told is to fail to live up to being a Mary. That interpretation, both misguided and abusive, is not what we should be taking from this passage. Both of these women are struggling, one under the weight of impossible expectations, and the other in trying to maintain herself in a position typically reserved for a more privileged class of people. Neither one has chosen an easy route, and neither is to blame for their present circumstances. Both are doing their best. This is where I think the Good Samaritan preceding this story might offer us a little bit of insight. That parable encourages us to fully embody God's command to love our neighbors as ourselves, while Jesus, at the same time, is expanding our idea of who exactly that neighbor is. But here, Luke is pointing out another important aspect of our relationship with our neighbor. That it isn't our job to judge or control one another. Luke's friend and frequent companion, Paul, tells us that a worker stands or falls before their boss not based on what the boss told someone else to do, but on what that boss told them to do. Here we have a physical example. Martha is working hard in genuine service, the same level of service expected of any other leader throughout the early church community. And you'll notice that Jesus' response to her isn't like a full rebuke for her work or for her struggling to complete her work. What he's doing is essentially telling her not to worry about what Mary is or isn't doing. Martha's work is good and important. And Mary's work, although different, is good and important as well. Both sisters, placed under similar expectations by society, are still seeking and serving God to the best of their ability. Each is doing something worthwhile, even if the other can't really recognize it in the moment. Martha, being overwhelmed, may indeed have a right to ask for Mary's help, but she doesn't have the authority to demand it of her, especially by publicly triangulating with a guest to shame her sister into compliance with her agenda. Mary selected this useful lot, which shouldn't be stolen from her, is how I would translate what Jesus says there. Each of us might be responsible for seeing to the needs of our neighbor, but none of us get to dictate the way our fellow disciples fulfill their duty of service to God or to one another.